You really think no one will question this?" The words came out low, steady, almost lost beneath the rustle of leaves and distant laughter, but they landed heavier than the warm afternoon air hanging over the park, and for a split second, even the pigeons seemed to hesitate mid-step across the concrete. Officer Daniel Hayes didn't answer right away. He adjusted his grip instead, fingers tightening around the edge of Angela Brooks' dress near the hem, as if control itself had weight, as if authority needed something physical to anchor it. And around them, people slowed without meaning to, eyes flickering over, phones subtly lifting, curiosity sharpening into something quieter, more watchful. Angela stood still, not frozen, not weak, just present, her shoulders relaxed in a way that didn't match the tension coiling around the moment, her gaze lifting to meet his without challenge, without fear, as though she had seen this exact scene unfold in different forms more times than anyone here could count. The sunlight slipped through the tall oak trees overhead, breaking into thin gold fragments that brushed against her face, caught in the soft fabric of her dress, now slightly pulled out of place, and there was something almost fragile in how the light touched it, something that made the gesture feel louder than it was. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to cooperate," Hayes said finally, his voice carrying just enough for the small circle of onlookers to hear, just enough to sound official, practiced, unquestioned, and yet beneath it there was a flicker, not doubt, but urgency, the kind that came from needing to be right in front of others. Angela exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, more like the release of a thought than breath, and her fingers tightened around the strap of the small bag resting against her side, not defensively, just instinctively, as if grounding herself in something simple while everything else leaned toward complication. Somewhere behind them, a child laughed, the sound bright and out of place, and it made the silence that followed feel sharper, more deliberate, like the world was holding itself just a fraction too still. Hayes stepped closer, closing the space that didn't need closing, his presence filling it with a kind of pressure that had nothing to do with distance, and the fabric shifted again under his hand, a subtle pull that drew a collective intake of breath from the nearest onlookers, quiet but unmistakable. Angela didn't step back. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying him not as a threat, not even as an obstacle, but as if she were trying to understand the exact moment where assumption had replaced truth. "You've already decided," she said softly, and the simplicity of it carried further than shouting ever could, threading through the murmurs, slipping past the layers of uniform and badge and expectation. For a heartbeat, Hayes hesitated, the smallest pause, almost invisible, but enough for the tension to shift, enough for the air to change texture, like the moment before a storm decides whether to break or pass. Then he straightened, posture sharpening, doubling down on certainty, and the park, with its open paths and easy sunlight, suddenly felt smaller, tighter, like everything within it had narrowed down to this single point where power met dignity and refused to recognize it. Angela's eyes didn't waver. Not once. Angela Brooks had learned a long time ago that moments like this did not begin where people thought they did. They did not begin with a hand reaching, or a voice accusing, or a crowd turning its attention all at once. They began much earlier, in smaller places, in quieter assumptions that built themselves into something heavier over time. And as she stood there beneath the filtered sunlight, she could feel that weight pressing in from every direction, even though no one had said anything outright yet. She had come to the park for something simple, something ordinary, a walk measured in slow steps along the paved path that curved around a small lake just under half a mile long. The kind of place where people came to breathe, to reset, to exist without being watched. And for a while it had been exactly that. The air had been warm but not heavy, somewhere in the mid-70s, with a light breeze that moved through the trees just enough to keep everything in motion without drawing attention to itself. She had paused near a bench not long before this, adjusting the strap of her bag, glancing out over the water where a few ducks traced soft ripples across the surface, and there had been a stillness there that felt earned, the kind that came after a life spent navigating noise. Angela was not someone who needed to be seen to feel grounded. In fact, she preferred the opposite, the quiet anonymity of blending into a space without leaving a mark. And yet, even in that preference there was a history, one shaped by years of understanding how quickly attention could shift, how easily it could become something else entirely. Her dress, simple and light, had been chosen for comfort rather than appearance, a soft fabric that moved easily with each step, something that did not demand notice, and her shoes, worn but clean, carried the imprint of long walks taken in places just like this, moments she claimed for herself without explanation. When she first noticed Officer Hayes, it had not been dramatic, not a sudden interruption, but a gradual awareness, the way one becomes conscious of being observed before confirming it, a subtle tightening in the air that had nothing to do with temperature. He had been standing near the path, speaking briefly into his radio, his posture straight, his presence firm in a way that suggested he expected to be obeyed before he even spoke, and Angela had felt that familiar calculation pass through her mind, not fear, not even concern, just recognition. She had kept walking, her pace unchanged, her gaze forward, offering no invitation for interaction, and for a moment it had seemed like that would be enough, like the moment would pass without consequence. But it did not. The call came from somewhere behind her, sharp enough to cut through the ambient sounds of the park without raising volume. Just authority shaped into a single word that carried expectation with it. And when she turned, slowly, deliberately, she had already understood the direction the moment was leaning toward. Now, standing in front of him, she felt the distance between who she was and who he believed her to be widen into something almost tangible, a space filled with assumption rather than truth. And what struck her most was not the accusation itself, but the certainty behind it, the way it left no room for anything else to exist. Around them, the park continued in fragments, a jogger passing at a distance, a couple lowering their voices as they walked by, the faint hum of traffic somewhere beyond the trees, all of it continuing as if this moment were both central and invisible at the same time. Angela's grip on her bag loosened slightly, her fingers relaxing as she shifted her weight just enough to stay balanced, grounded, present. And when she looked at Hayes again, really looked at him, she did not see a man reacting to evidence or even to suspicion. She saw someone responding to a story he had already decided was true. That realization did not surprise her, but it settled into her chest with a quiet heaviness, the kind that did not demand reaction but required endurance. And as the murmurs around them grew just a little louder, as more eyes turned, as more phones lifted without permission or hesitation, Angela remained exactly where she was, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because leaving would have meant accepting a version of herself that had never belonged to her in the first place. Officer Daniel Hayes had spent most of his career learning how to read a situation before it fully unfolded, or at least that was what he told himself. That instinct mattered more than hesitation. That quick decisions defined control, and standing there now with the late afternoon light cutting across his uniform in sharp angles, he leaned into that belief with a quiet stubbornness that had followed him for years. His badge caught the sunlight just enough to flash when he shifted, a small, deliberate movement that drew the eye, and he was aware of it, aware of how presence worked in spaces like this, how authority was not just enforced but performed, shaped by posture, tone, and the unspoken expectation that people would comply before they even considered questioning. The call that had brought his attention to Angela had been vague, something about a possible disturbance, something about a woman matching a general description, but in his mind that had been enough to act, enough to justify the direction his thoughts had already begun to take before he even saw her clearly. Around them, the park had not stopped, but it had shifted, conversations lowering into murmurs, footsteps slowing just slightly, the kind of collective awareness that built quietly without anyone announcing it. And Hayes could feel it, could feel the weight of being watched settle across his shoulders in a way that made him straighten further, his voice firming when he spoke again. "I asked you a question," he said, not louder, just sharper, the edges of his words defined by expectation rather than volume, and his eyes searched her face not for truth, but for confirmation of what he already believed he would find. Angela did not rush to answer, not because she could not, but because she understood the rhythm of moments like this, how speaking too quickly often fed into the narrative already forming, how silence, when held correctly, could reveal more than any defense ever would. Hayes interpreted that pause differently. his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly as he shifted his stance, one foot angling forward as if closing a gap that had never been physical to begin with. And he reached again toward the fabric of her dress, not aggressively, not dramatically, but with the kind of casual certainty that suggested he did not expect resistance. To him, this was procedure shaped by instinct, a routine that had blurred into habit over time, and each second that passed without immediate compliance only reinforced his need to assert control more clearly. A man standing a few feet away adjusted his grip on his phone, angling it for a better view, while a woman near the bench pressed her lips together, her hands tightening around the strap of her purse, as if unsure whether to step forward or remain exactly where she was, and the tension between action and inaction spread through the small crowd like a quiet current. Hayes glanced briefly at the growing circle of onlookers, and something in his expression hardened, not uncertainty, but resolve, as though the presence of witnesses demanded a stronger display rather than a reconsideration. "If you have nothing to hide, then this will be quick," he added, the words rehearsed, familiar, carrying a tone that had closed conversations long before they could begin in countless other moments. And yet there was a subtle shift now, something less certain beneath the surface, something he did not fully recognize. Angela's gaze remained steady, not confrontational, not submissive, simply unwavering. And in that steadiness there was a quiet contradiction to everything he expected, a refusal to fit into the role he had already assigned her. The breeze moved again through the trees, lifting a few strands of her hair, brushing against the fabric he still held, and for a brief second the world seemed to narrow to that single point of contact, that single assumption stretched thin against reality, and Hayes, without realizing it, tightened his grip just slightly, as if holding on to certainty itself while everything around him began, almost imperceptibly, to shift. Angela did not move when his grip shifted again, not because she was unaware of it, but because she chose not to let that small action define the moment, and instead she lifted her chin just slightly, enough for the light to catch the calm in her expression, enough to make it clear that she was still in control of herself even if everything around her was trying to suggest otherwise. "You are not looking for the truth," she said quietly, her voice even, steady, carrying just far enough to reach him without inviting the crowd into it. And for a brief second the words seemed to settle between them like something tangible, something that could not easily be dismissed. Hayes let out a short breath, more through his nose than his mouth, a sign of irritation he did not bother to hide, and his fingers tightened reflexively before he released the fabric, only to reach again, this time more deliberately, as if correcting a hesitation he did not want anyone to notice. The movement was not forceful, but it was firm, a gesture meant to assert control rather than escalate, and the subtle shift of the material drew another ripple of reaction from the onlookers, quiet gasps, lowered voices, the soft click of a phone adjusting focus. Angela felt the change in tension not in his hand, but in the space around them, the way attention had sharpened, the way silence had deepened into something expectant, and still she did not step back. Instead, she reached into her bag slowly, deliberately, her movements careful not to startle, not to give him any excuse to reinterpret them. And for a moment Hayes stiffened, his posture tightening as his training surfaced, his hand hovering midair as if deciding whether to intervene. "I am not reaching for anything that concerns you," Angela said before he could speak, her tone calm but unmistakably certain, and she withdrew a small, neatly folded item, a light scarf, soft gray, the kind that could disappear into any setting without drawing attention. She unfolded it with quiet precision and draped it across the area where the fabric of her dress had been disturbed, not hurried, not embarrassed, just composed, as though restoring something that had never truly been taken from her in the first place. The simplicity of the action shifted something in the air, a subtle recalibration that Hayes could feel but could not immediately name, and it unsettled him more than resistance ever would have. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be," he said, though the certainty in his voice had thinned just slightly, enough for the words to feel less like a statement and more like an attempt to regain footing. Angela met his gaze again, her eyes clear, unwavering, and for the first time there was something else there, not anger, not fear, but a quiet resolve that carried its own kind of authority, one that did not rely on volume or position. "No," she replied softly. "It was already complicated the moment you decided what I was before asking who I am." The words did not rise, did not sharpen, but they landed with a weight that shifted the balance of the moment, and around them the crowd seemed to lean in without moving, caught between witnessing and understanding. Hayes glanced briefly to the side, to the phones, to the faces watching, and something in. His posture adjusted again, a recalculation happening beneath the surface, quick, practiced, but not entirely successful. He stepped half a pace closer, closing the space once more, as if proximity alone could re-establish control, and the badge on his chest caught the light again, flashing briefly like a signal he still believed in. "I need you to cooperate," he repeated, but this time the words carried a trace of something else, something less certain, something that did not fully align with the confidence he had shown moments before. Angela did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood, steady as the ground beneath her, the scarf resting lightly against her dress, her presence quiet but unyielding, and in that stillness there was a shift, small but undeniable, as if the moment itself had begun to tilt in a direction neither of them had fully anticipated. The silence did not break all at once. It fractured, thin at the edges, as whispers slipped between people who did not want to be heard but could not stay completely quiet. And somewhere behind the circle, a voice murmured, "This does not look right." Barely audible, yet enough to ripple outward in small, uneven waves that reached Hayes without ever directly confronting him. He felt it, not as words, but as pressure, the kind that settled behind the eyes, that made every movement feel slightly more visible than before, and for a brief second, his hand hovered again, uncertain whether to continue or pull back, caught between instinct and awareness. Angela remained still, the gray scarf resting lightly across her dress, her fingers no longer gripping her bag but relaxed at her side, and there was something about that stillness that refused to cooperate with the narrative unfolding around her, something that made the moment feel increasingly out of alignment. Hayes cleared his throat, a small, controlled sound meant to reassert presence, and he stepped to the side just enough to reposition himself between Angela and the growing cluster of onlookers, as though shielding the situation from interpretation or perhaps shaping how it would be seen. "I am asking you one more time," he said, his voice firm, but the edge had shifted, sharpened not by confidence but by the need to maintain it. "Do you have anything on you that you should not?" The question lingered, heavy with implication, and for a moment, even the breeze seemed to pause, the leaves overhead holding still as if waiting for something to resolve. Angela looked at him, not quickly, not reactively, but with a measured calm that felt almost out of place against the tightening atmosphere. And when she spoke, her voice carried a quiet clarity that did not compete with his, but did not yield to it either. "I have exactly what I brought with me," she said, simple, direct, leaving no room for interpretation, yet offering no defense beyond truth itself. A man near the edge of the crowd shifted his weight, lowering his phone slightly as if reconsidering what he was capturing, while another voice, farther back, asked softly, "Did anyone even see anything happen?" The question did not receive an answer, but it did not disappear either. It hovered, unclaimed, adding another layer to the tension that had already begun to stretch thin. Hayes heard it, even if he pretended not to, and something in his posture tightened again, not outwardly, but in the small adjustments of his shoulders, the way he squared himself against a challenge that had not been formally made. "That is not how this works," he replied, though the statement felt less grounded than before, as if it were being repeated rather than believed, and he glanced briefly at her bag, at the scarf, at anything that might justify the direction he had taken, searching for confirmation where there was none readily visible. Angela followed that glance, not with suspicion, but with a quiet awareness, and she gently lifted her bag with one hand, holding it out slightly, not in surrender, not in fear, but in openness, the gesture slow and deliberate, as if placing the truth directly in front of him without forcing him to take it. The movement shifted the crowd again, a subtle intake of breath passing through those closest, and Hayes hesitated, just long enough for it to register, just long enough for the certainty he had carried into the moment to flicker. He did not immediately reach for the bag. Instead, he looked at her again, really looked, and for the first time there was a crack in the narrative he had built, small but undeniable, a hesitation that did not belong to procedure or instinct, but to something deeper, something that did not align with the version of events he had already committed to. The sunlight shifted slightly as a cloud passed overhead, softening the sharp edges of the scene, and in that muted light, the contrast between them became clearer, not louder, not more dramatic, just more real, as if the moment itself had begun to reveal something neither of them could fully control anymore. The moment stretched without breaking, the kind of silence that did not demand noise to be understood, and for the first time since it began, nothing moved forward, nothing escalated, nothing resolved. It simply held, suspended between what had been assumed and what was beginning to surface. Angela's arm remained extended, the bag resting lightly in her hand, not offered as proof, not surrendered as evidence, just present, an open fact in a space that had been built on closed conclusions, and the stillness of that gesture began to settle into everything around it. The breeze returned, softer now, threading through the branches overhead, carrying with it the faint rustle of leaves that brushed against one another like quiet voices choosing not to speak too loudly, and the sunlight, filtered through a passing cloud, softened across the ground, turning sharp contrasts into something more diffused, more reflective. Hayes did not take the bag. His hand, which had hovered only moments ago, lowered slowly to his side, not in defeat, not in surrender, but in something less defined, something that did not have a clear name yet, and his eyes, which had been searching for confirmation, shifted again, not outward this time, not toward the crowd, but inward, as though recalculating a narrative that no longer aligned as cleanly as it had before. A child somewhere behind the gathering let out a small laugh, then quickly hushed, the sound fading almost as soon as it appeared, leaving behind a faint echo that felt out of place in the weight of the moment. A woman near the bench adjusted her stance, crossing her arms loosely, her expression no longer uncertain but observant, as if she had moved from witnessing to understanding without needing to say so. Angela slowly lowered her arm, not because she had been asked to, not because the moment required it, but because it no longer needed to be held there, and the motion was smooth, unhurried, the kind that signaled completion without announcement. She did not look away from Hayes, but her gaze softened slightly, not in submission, not in concession, but in recognition of something shifting, something that had begun outside of her control but was now revealing itself in a different light. "You can take your time," she said quietly, and the words did not carry challenge or impatience, only a calm acknowledgement that whatever decision came next would say more than anything that had already happened. Hayes inhaled, slow, measured, the kind of breath that filled the chest more than it released tension, and for a brief second, the rigidity in his shoulders eased, just enough to break the pattern he had been holding since the beginning. He glanced again at the bag, then at her face, then beyond her, where the park continued in fragments of normalcy, a jogger passing at a distance, the faint hum of traffic threading through the trees, life moving forward in ways that did not wait for resolution. The badge on his chest caught the softened light again, but this time it did not flash, it simply reflected, a muted gleam that no longer dominated the space the way it had before. The crowd did not press closer, but it did not disperse either. It remained, held in quiet observation, no longer driven by curiosity alone, but by the sense that something important, though not loud, was unfolding. Angela shifted her weight slightly, grounding herself in the same steady posture she had held from the beginning, her presence unchanged even as the energy around her recalibrated. And in that steadiness there was a kind of quiet gravity, something that did not demand attention yet held it all the same. The moment had not resolved, but it had transformed, and in that transformation, something unspoken had begun to surface, something neither of them had planned for, something that could not be undone by simply continuing as if nothing had changed. The sound did not belong to the park, not to the rustling leaves or distant footsteps or muted conversations that had settled into the background. It came sharp and distinct, the low hum of engines approaching in unison, steady, controlled, and it cut through the suspended moment with a precision that made several heads turn at once before anyone fully understood why. Hayes heard it too, his eyes shifting past Angela for the first time in several seconds, drawn not by curiosity, but by instinct, and what he saw did not immediately register as unusual until the vehicles came into view, dark, polished, moving slowly along the park's outer drive, where traffic rarely demanded attention. The first car eased to a stop just beyond the path, followed by another, then a third, each one aligning with quiet coordination that did not require explanation, and the air changed again, not abruptly, but with a subtle shift in weight, as though something larger had entered the space without raising its voice. A man stepped out from the lead vehicle, his posture composed, his presence unmistakably official. Though he did not rush, did not call out, he simply moved forward with a purpose that did not need to announce itself. The crowd responded before anyone spoke, parting slightly, not in panic, not even in confusion, but in recognition of something they could not yet name, and Hayes felt it immediately, the recalibration of attention, the way focus began to move past him rather than toward him. Angela did not turn right away. She remained exactly where she was, her gaze still on Hayes, her posture unchanged, and there was something in that stillness that now carried a different weight, something that no longer belonged solely to the moment they had created. Then, quietly, almost as if acknowledging something already understood, she shifted her eyes past him. The man approaching slowed as he reached the edge of the gathering, his expression composed but alert, and when his gaze landed on Angela, something in it changed, not dramatically, not for the crowd, but enough to be unmistakable for anyone close enough to see. "Angela," he said, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a familiarity that did not ask permission to exist, and the name settled into the space like a key turning in a lock no one else had known was there. Hayes froze, not visibly at first, but in the small, almost imperceptible stilling of his posture, the way his shoulders stopped adjusting, the way his breathing paused just long enough to break rhythm. He turned slightly, just enough to see the man more clearly, and recognition did not arrive all at once. It built in fragments, the face, the presence, the context that snapped into place with quiet inevitability. The crowd reacted in pieces, whispers sharpening, phones lowering, eyes widening as understanding spread unevenly through the group, and the space that had once been centered on Hayes shifted completely, redirecting itself towards something far beyond him. Angela's expression did not change. She did not step forward. She did not explain. She simply stood, the gray scarf still resting against her dress, her presence steady, as if nothing about this moment required adjustment from her at all. The man reached her side and stopped, not touching her, not drawing attention beyond what was already there. But his proximity alone spoke volumes, and when he looked from her to Hayes, the silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before. Hayes' hand, which had hovered near his side, lowered fully now, his fingers curling slightly, as if unsure where to rest. And for the first time since the moment began, the certainty that had defined him was gone, replaced by something far quieter, far more uncertain. No one spoke. No one needed to. The truth had arrived without being announced, and it did not ask for permission to be understood. Hayes' throat tightened before he realized it, a small, involuntary reaction that did not show on his face, but settled somewhere deeper, somewhere harder to control, and he straightened instinctively, not out of confidence this time, but out of reflex, the kind drilled into him for moments. Involving higher authority, moments where presence had to shift quickly, decisively, without question. "Sir," he said, the word coming out more formal than anything he had spoken all afternoon, and for the first time, his voice carried a trace of something unfamiliar, not fear exactly, but awareness, sharp and immediate. Governor Michael Brooks did not respond right away. His gaze remained on Angela for a fraction longer, scanning not for explanation but for assurance, and when she gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, something in his posture eased just slightly before his attention turned fully to Hayes. The silence between them was not empty. It was dense, filled with everything that had already happened, everything that had been assumed, everything that now stood exposed without needing to be repeated. Hayes felt it pressing in, felt the weight of every eye still fixed on him, not with curiosity anymore, but with clarity, and his hands, which had once moved with certainty, now remained still at his sides, unsure of their place. "Officer," the governor said at last, his tone controlled, measured, carrying authority without needing to raise volume. and the single word was enough to shift the balance entirely, to redefine the moment without rewriting it. Hayes opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again, the explanation he had been ready to give dissolving before it could take shape, because nothing he could say would align with what was now clearly understood. "I was responding to a report," he managed finally, the sentence incomplete even as it left him, lacking the conviction it might have held only minutes earlier, and he avoided looking directly at Angela, not out of defiance, but because something in that gaze had become harder to face. The governor did not interrupt, did not challenge, he simply listened, and that quiet listening carried more weight than any immediate correction could have. Around them, the crowd had fallen into a deeper stillness, phones lowering, voices fading, the need to capture replaced by the need to witness, and even the ambient sounds of the park seemed to recede, as if giving space to what was unfolding. Angela shifted her weight slightly, the gray scarf still resting against her dress, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, unhurried, carrying none of the tension that had defined the moment before. He saw what he expected to see, she said softly, not to defend him, not to accuse, but to state something that had already been revealed, and the simplicity of it landed more firmly than any argument could have. Hayes looked at her then, just briefly, and in that glance there was recognition, not of her status, not of the situation, but of the truth in what she had said, and it settled into him with a quiet finality that left no room for denial. The governor's expression did not harden, but it did not soften either. It remained composed, deliberate, and he gave a small nod, not in agreement with the action, but in acknowledgement of the clarity. "We will address this," he said, not as a threat, not as a promise, but as a certainty, something that did not need emphasis to be understood. Hayes nodded quickly, once, the motion controlled but unmistakably deferential, and he took a half step back, not retreating, but creating space, as if the ground beneath him had shifted just enough to require adjustment. Angela did not move toward the governor, did not reach for him. She simply stood where she had been from the beginning, her presence unchanged, and in that stillness there was a quiet resolution forming, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, as the moment began to settle into something that could no longer be undone. The crowd did not disperse immediately, but it no longer pressed inward either. It simply loosened, like a held breath finally released without sound, and the space that had once felt tight and watchful opened again, not completely, but enough for movement to return in quiet, careful steps. Hayes remained where he was for a moment longer, his posture still upright, still trained, but no longer anchored in certainty, and the badge on his chest caught the light one last time before the cloud above shifted again, dimming it into something softer, less defined. He nodded once more, slower this time, as if acknowledging not just the presence before him, but the weight of what had unfolded. And then he stepped back fully, not turning away abruptly, not retreating in haste, just creating distance, the kind that spoke more clearly than any words he might have offered. Angela watched him go without following, without holding him in place with her gaze, and when he finally turned and moved toward the edge of the path, blending back into the role he had carried into the park, it was different now, quieter, less certain, as though something essential had shifted beneath the surface. Governor Brooks stood beside her, not imposing, not drawing attention beyond what had already settled around them, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them not heavy, not strained, but complete, as if everything that needed to be understood already had been. The vehicles remained where they had stopped, engines low, steady, their presence no longer an interruption but a continuation of what had changed the moment itself, and one by one, the people who had gathered began to move again, some walking past with lowered eyes, others glancing back once before continuing on, their phones now at their sides, no longer raised, no longer needed. Angela adjusted the gray scarf lightly across her dress, the fabric settling back into place with a quiet grace that mirrored her composure, and she exhaled slowly, not from relief, not from release, but from a steady return to herself, the same calm she had carried into the park before any of this had begun. The breeze moved again, brushing gently against the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of grass and warm pavement, and the lake just beyond the path reflected the softened sky in long, rippling lines that stretched and shifted without urgency. Governor Brooks glanced at her, his expression measured but no longer searching, and he gave a small nod, one that did not ask for anything in return, and she answered it with the same quiet acknowledgement she had given before, no more, no less. They began to walk, not hurried, not escorted, just side by side along the same path she had been on earlier, their steps even, unforced, and as they moved, the distance between them and the moment behind them grew without effort, without the need to leave it marked or explained. No one stopped them. No one called out. The park returned to its rhythm and layers, footsteps aligning with gravel paths, voices rising back in a casual conversation, the ordinary reassembling itself around something that had been anything but ordinary. Angela did not look back, not because she could not, but because there was nothing behind her that needed to be revisited, nothing that required confirmation or closure beyond what had already been seen. And as the sunlight broke through the thinning clouds once more, it caught the edge of the scarf resting across her shoulder, tracing a quiet line of light that moved with her, steady, unbroken. The moment ended not with words, not with apology, not with declaration, but with something far quieter, something that lingered in the space it left behind, where power had once spoken loudly and been answered, not with force, but with presence. And in that presence, something undeniable had been revealed, something that did not fade even as the world around it moved on.